So I came out here the other day and I was getting my rods and reels ready. It's starting to warm up here, we're in Illinois. And I realized that at the end of last season I had broke a rod clean in two and I was gonna toss it. But for whatever reason I decided to save it. We were out fishing a stream for smallies. We were throwing inline spinners and it was about 50 degrees. It was fall. I hooked a log, gave it a good tug once or twice. The rod doubled over and it just snapped. I've caught a decent number of fish on this rod. Is it sentimental? Maybe a little bit. But let me show you some close-ups of the break here. And as you can see, this guide section was actually pulling away. The binding here was pulling away and the epoxy was chipping before the rod broke. I noticed there were a lot of videos on YouTube on fixing rods and I figured there's probably a way to salvage this where we'll only lose maybe a little bit of sensitivity, but it's still going to be very usable. It's a medium light 6.6 Bass Pro Bionic blade, probably $90 rod. We're going to get this all taken apart and get started. Real quick before we start too, one of the things I do not want to do, I found a couple tutorials on YouTube where they say take a hacksaw and actually cut the upper part down, in some cases close to a foot. And then that way, what you can do is take and actually set this rod in the lower portion, but I don't want my 6.5 foot rod to become a 5.5 foot rod. So we're gonna do this a little different, and I think we're gonna be able to maintain the exact size that it was before it got broke. So here's some things you'll need. The pole you broke, a dowel rod, sandpaper, epoxy, not a hacksaw, gloves, a flashlight, utility knife, you always need a utility knife, these cutty things, superline, and some rod wrap finisher. So the way we're gonna do this is we're gonna take a dowel rod and we're gonna insert it into the blank. Now, I measured the break at the widest point, and it's about 1/8 of an inch. So I got 1/8 of an inch dowel rod, got my tin snips, cut off about a 4-inch section. And what I plan to do now is take this and taper it down. We're gonna put about 1.5 inches in the lower part of the blank. We're gonna put the rest in the upper part of the blank, epoxy it in place. The reason we're using wood, I've seen several methods online where people will take a metal sleeve and put it around the blank. I saw a video where a guy cut off about 1 foot of his rod and inserted the upper part into the lower part and locked it in place somehow. And while these are all probably good methods and functional, I don't want a big eyesore on my pole, and I also don't want to lose a foot off of it. This wood is going to soak up some of the epoxy. It's going to be easy to work with. It's not going to add hardly any weight to my pole. The point of the break, there's still a lot of backbone. I don't know that this is even giving that much here. I think this might be the start of where the backbone kind of gives way to the bend. But if we were to put a metal nail in here and the nail got bent, we'd have a permanent bend in our pole. So I want to stay away from metal. When we finish, we're going to wrap the whole thing in the superline, put a coat of rod wrap finish on top of that. So the only thing that you're going to see is a new extended wrap essentially. We're also going to use that to strengthen up this guide, which is the epoxy's on it is kind of cracked. So we're going to lock that back down into place. So it's a win-win. One other thing too before we get started, we're actually not going to trim down the splinters at the break point on the rod. We're going to use those once we put the dowel in place to make sure we line the rod up perfectly as it was before it broke. And then we'll sand it down and smooth it out before we do our wrap over the top of that. But we also don't want to hacksaw it off because then we'll lose a little bit of length on the rod, which we don't want to do. First thing we're going to do is get this guy out of here. Okay, I actually lied last night. There's 2 more things that you're gonna need. One is toothpicks, and the other is something to mix your epoxy on. I'm just using tin foil here. So like I said, we're gonna use these splinters that are left over, hanging off the ends here, to line up our blank in exactly the same spot. And then we'll clean that up after the fact, and then we're gonna wrap the whole thing past the original wrap and up further. So the first thing we gotta do is take this dowel rod and sand it down, taper it, and I'm gonna mark it with, I'll just use this utility knife. I wanna make sure I have about yay far in the bottom here. Less in the bottom than in the top, because the top's gonna be sanded, so it's gonna be weaker. So we'll just mark this. Right now I'm using about, this is 150 grit. Starting to taper. Now I'm trying to not do too much. We don't want to do too much here because we can't add wood back on. That's perfect. Nice and snug there. So we're gonna get out the heavy duty 40 grit and get to work here. We're getting there. So now here's where your flashlight comes in. If you want to look in here and see if you have any obstructions, which we do not. See, once I know this top part's fitting to here, I'm being really careful to only sand right here where it's too fat to fit, because I want this as tight as possible up in this blank here. And man, that's close. We're right there. You don't want it too snug or you'll split your blank even further. There we go. Okay. Now, we got it where we want it sitting. As you can see, now it's nice and sanded and tapered. We're going to put it in the top section first because that's a snug fit. It's not going to push past where we want it to stop. If we were to put it in the bottom gets fatter as it goes. So if we put pressure on it when it gets to the certain point where we want it to sit, it's just going to keep pushing down instead of getting up snug in the top part of the blank. We're going to get our epoxy going. Okay, this just turned into the how not to do this segment. Remember that hacksaw I said you weren't going to need? Okay, so the moral here is buy new epoxy. Okay, so fortunately we were able to salvage enough here. This is more than enough. All we're going to do is load the entrance. We're going to let the wood push the epoxy up in there. I don't want a bunch of excess epoxy in the blank in case when it bends it breaks. I'm not sure how this stuff acts. Shouldn't break. One more glop. Take we're just going to go for it here. Oh, that ain't going anywhere. Okay, now remember I said we were going to use these splinters to line up the pieces. I'm lining it up as I push this in here. Right into place. Get this epoxy off here as quick as you can. And that is, check your guides. That is dead nuts. So what we'll do now is we'll let that cure. We're gonna come back out, we're gonna get our sandpaper, we're gonna clean up the area. We might melt some of this old, we'll probably just leave it, the old wrap. We're gonna wrap from here up, we're gonna wrap from here down. Maybe we'll just wrap from here down and continue over the guide to about here. And then we're gonna coat that with our rod wrap finish, which is good because I'm out of epoxy, obviously. That was quite the mess. Probably check that type of stuff before you tape yourself, huh? All right. Okay, so my epoxy's had 24 hours to dry, and I just came out. Everything looks good. So now what we're gonna do, I'll show you a close-up of how that looks. It's lined up perfect, but what we're gonna do is we're gonna go at this with sandpaper just real lightly because we don't wanna mess up the fiberglass at all. But we just wanna kind of smooth that out. And then we're gonna start our wrap. Go ahead and clean up this area a little bit. So now I don't think I'm going to remove this old epoxy, and I think I'm just going to wrap over the top of this because my break happened right above this guide. So we're going to wrap from about here to here with Superline and epoxy it. this will be pretty solid when it's done. But our crack now is nice and smooth here. So that looks really good. So let's reinforce that. Let me show you my wrap station here. So you can see I don't have a fancy wrap station. So what I do have is 2 rail bags where my pole's gonna sit. And then I have this bag that I keep just tools and stuff in. And we're gonna wrap with Superline. It's a braided Superline, so it should soak up the epoxy. And that's coming from the floor, underneath the bag, up and around this. And it's gonna go onto the pole like that. And that's gonna be my quote unquote tension spring that you see guys using. So we got 50 degrees out today. I'm ready to go fish. Let's get this done. Okay, so I'm having a heck of a time getting this line started here. Because we're using Superline, this is a braid. It's gonna soak up the epoxy, which is what we want, and it's super strong. That's what I want on the rod. It's also extremely slippery. So normally what you do, we're gonna go ahead and wrap to the right here. We're gonna go up we're just gonna cover up the old epoxy, get snug on the other side of the guide and go up about half an inch, maybe an inch tops above our break, which is right above the guide foot here. However, normally what you would do is you'd come over to top and then you would cross over with your string with the tension on it, and that one crossover is enough to lock this thread in place, and you can cut it off. Unfortunately, this stuff is so slippery, we're gonna do things a little bit different. We're gonna go 1, 2, 3 times around, pull that really tight, and then we're just gonna jump over and go 1, 2, 3 times around, cinch everything down. So we did 3 times around on this side, and then we came over underneath this, did 3 times around on this side. Now we're gonna move this thread over the first 3, so it's jumped over here. So our thread now is the furthest right on the rod, and we're gonna start working our way up. And we're gonna keep a thumb on this and keep tension on it. Really do this as snug as possible. You wanna keep this tag end out of the way here. And if we get a couple loops on here, it's gonna bite in, and we'll be able to just go with it. But I've done this like 6 times today, and it just keeps popping free. I get halfway up over the guide foot here, and it'll just pop free. So there, I think we got tension. And we're just gonna continue nice and easy all the way up. Gonna jump right up over our old epoxy here. Taking my time. Nudge that down a little bit. We want nice tight wraps here. Okay, I pulled out about 20 feet of Superline, so I got plenty. When we get up to this guide, what we're going to try to do is angle the pole and go nice and slow, and we're going to try to actually work our way around it completely. See, my thread just jumped off the old epoxy line. snug. We're going to angle it. We're actually going to swoop our guide underneath. We're going to push it down. Push it down. Nice and snug. And we're going to do it again. Swoop our guide. Push. Swoop our guide. Push. And I'm just constantly, because it's rough in here, I don't want any gaps, and I'm constantly just kind of using my thumb like you would a burnishing tool, because I don't want to stop. Now that I got a little head of steam going here, I'm just trying to keep this as tight as possible. And I can almost just about start wrapping like normal. Is it overkill? Yes. I know some critiques are going to be, you wrapped more than you had to, should have taken off your old epoxy, and that's fine. I don't want this to move anywhere. We're going to snip that off. Okay, so now we're getting near the end here. I'm probably going to do about 10 more wraps. So what we're going to do is I already took this little, maybe 6-inch, 8-inch piece. We're going to make a loop, so you can see that, and we're going to just set it down right up in our wrap. I'm actually going to do it on the side opposite of the guide. And we're going to go around that. If I can get it damn. There. All right. Keeping attention here with this finger. Actually, let's go like this. So I got my loop ready. I'm gonna cut my braid, drop it down in this loop, pull it tight. And my hand is completely cramped up, so we're going to cheat here. Okay. What we need to do is we need to pull this loop out, which is going to pull our string down. So I got it started so it's stuck. I'm going to wrap this around here. There. Just popped it down and through. So, being extremely careful, we're going to cut this guy. And we're going to push that all down on itself again. Snug her in there. Okay. Now, down here on this end, we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to pull it nice and tight as much as possible, because we don't want that to move. I want to go ahead and flatten my threads. I think we'll be able to flatten these threads slightly. I'm gonna push down on this guy. Try to cover that up as much as possible. Push these guys down. So, combat ready. Not the prettiest thing you've ever seen, but should be pretty solid, honestly. Especially once we get some epoxy over that beast. So now what we're gonna do is I'm actually gonna set this on the thread, and I'm gonna pull this guy towards me, which is kind of what you're supposed to do anyway. And then we're just gonna very lightly snug this one up. And there is our completed wrap. It's locked on itself. If I hold this out, that's added like no weight whatsoever. I don't know that we're gonna need anything more than that. I think the next step is just check it out for any visual flaws. I mean, there's a couple, especially where our line came through. I can kind of nudge those in place a little bit. Now I'm gonna stop playing with it. That's done. Now I have to sit out here and hand turn this once we put our epoxy on it, because I don't have a motorized wrap machine like some people do. So that's our wrap. Epoxy's next. Let's do this. Essentially what we did here is we took Superline and we wrapped about a 3-inch section on the rod. Our break is right here above where the guide sits. We just wrapped over the old epoxy. I'm hoping that doesn't cause any complications. It might, but the important thing here is strength. My wraps are pretty tight. There's a few gaps where you can see it jumped over. There's a bump here in the epoxy where it actually, as I was sanding, I busted the top thread. So there's a little gap. There's a train going by right now. Welcome to the Midwest, folks. So we actually continued our wrap all the way up over the top of the guide, and it's pretty tight. So my braid is now locked in place. I'm gonna quit messing with it. We're gonna mix up some flex coat. I've never used this stuff before. I believe it's 50-50, and then you go ahead and coat your rod. Because I'm on my my ghetto, rod station here, we're gonna go ahead and do this whole thing by hand. And this is high build, it says. I've never used high build before. I'm hoping it sets up pretty quick, because I don't want to sit out here for an hour and a half spinning this. So let's do 50-50. That should be more than enough. Now, as I brush this on, the braid should soak up a lot of this, which is good. That's what we want. It should act similar to thread, like you would normally wrap rod guides in. And we're gonna coat this up pretty good, but I don't want to put so much on there that it starts chipping. One of the things I didn't mention earlier, or I'm not sure if I mentioned earlier, was when we were putting the dowel rod inside of the blank, I only loaded up the first maybe ½ inch of the inside there with epoxy. You could see on the outside the dowel pushed it out of the way, but I didn't want to put so much in there that when the rod bent, the epoxy would chip and crack, and then I'd have something rattling inside my rod. So we don't want to overdo it. I don't think that would happen, but never know. So that's about good. Okay. So I'm just going to start with a little bit here. Now I've seen guys take lighters and hold them underneath their epoxy to remove bubbles. We might do that and we might not need to. All I'm doing now is just putting a little bit of paper towel on here and kind of rotating and moving the epoxy up back towards the threads. Just clean it up a little bit. Okay, so now I'm going to sit here for about 10 minutes and do this. Okay, now we've got a little bit of excess on there. So that's what we want. I really want this built up on there, I just don't want it getting on the guide. So now it's starting, there, I'll sit here and do this. It's starting to level out pretty good. There, now we do have quite a bit of bubbles. Again, this just needs to be heavy duty, it doesn't need to be pretty. But we also have a nice capsule of epoxy on there. So I'm going to keep spinning this around for a while, make sure it all is nice and level. And those bubbles, we're just going to live with them. Okay, so I've been sitting here for like 20-25 minutes doing this. The epoxy is still running. I would highly recommend you get one of those little turning motors. I will be getting one before I do any more wraps. Granted, I glopped a lot of epoxy on here because I want to really make sure this is solid, but holy crap. Plus then if it was on a little motor, I'd have two hands, I could get out a little trigger torch, propane torch, or gas map gas torch, and I could put a little tiny bit of heat on this epoxy and probably get rid of quite a few of these bubbles. So the only nice thing is that I'm able to kind of shimmy the epoxy back and forth by raising and lowering the tip as I'm spinning it, and I'm able to keep the epoxy from getting up on the guide as I'm going here. But I think I'll be getting a little motor before I do this again. So see you in an hour and a half. So the next thing we're going to do is test this. Sitting here thinking about that, just staring at the fix. since I have an hour to sit here and look at this. There's a pond not too far from here, and it's got a lot of weeds in it. We'll go ahead and put a float on this and put some meat on it and go snag some channel cat. We'll do that in another video. And if we can pull those cats through the weeds and the rod doesn't snap, I'd say we have a good fix. If the rod breaks, then don't do this. So yeah, one other thing while I'm sitting here thinking about things, I would strongly recommend you do a couple of your own wraps, because it kind of takes the mystery out of things. And the next time you go to buy a rod, you're gonna look at the wraps. You're gonna look to see if they're nice and tight. You're gonna look at the epoxy. You're gonna see if the epoxy is chipping at the guide foot, where the base of the guide meets the rod, especially if they're like these Fuji single foot guides. And you'll start to notice things that you didn't notice before when you're buying a rod. So it's opened up my eyes to a lot of things. This is not going to be the prettiest thing when it's done, but it'll be functional, and that's the most important part. But yeah, I would strongly recommend you at least do a couple. And hey, worst case scenario, if you have the supplies and you do what I did and you break a rod on a stump, then you can hopefully fix it. So we'll go out and test this. Once this hardens up, we'll give this a couple days. I'm looking for an excuse to get out. So, like I need an excuse. So we'll go, once this all sets up good and solid, go test it out. Well, the epoxy's at about 36 hours to dry. Everything's hardened up. So the next thing that we're gonna do is we're gonna take this out and we're gonna test it in another video. We're gonna make sure that the rod doesn't snap when we hook a fish. One thing I wanna point out, I would highly recommend, if you guys take on a project similar to this, get a motor that will turn your rod as you apply epoxy. I sat here for about probably an hour, over an hour, turning it by hand until the epoxy stiffened up enough that it was gelatinous. It wasn't running off, it wasn't dripping off, but it was gelled up hard enough that I was able to take it inside, make a pizza for everybody, and I would set a timer, 3 minutes, and then I would walk in the other room and spin it, 180 degrees. 3 minutes, and then I'd walk in there and spin it, 180. And then after I started to notice less drips, and I bumped it up to 4 minutes, 4 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, 6 minutes, 7 minutes. And that went on until 9:30 at night, when I could finally rotate it every 15 minutes. So again, highly recommend getting a motor. Thank you guys for sticking with me. I know this has been kind of a long project, but we've come a long way from a busted rod to a pretty good fix that looks pretty nice. And the next thing we're gonna do is take it out and test it and make sure that it's solid. We didn't lose any length on the rod. We've added hardly zero weight, and I'm pretty confident that we've salvaged it. So I want to thank you guys again for sticking with me, and I'd like to invite you to head over to Clear.Water.Sky to see what we're building. Whether you're into hiking, camping, fishing, mountain biking, anything outdoors, we'd love to hear from you. So please subscribe, please comment. We'll catch you in the next video. Thanks. The epoxy's hardened, but it's not completely stiff. Don't say that. Things you will need: gloves, sandpaper, a dowel rod, epoxy, a flashlight, a utility knife, these cutty things. Oh, shit. Okay. I'm pretty happy with the way it came out. Don't say Don't say Cut, that was good. Insert some pictures. To dry, the epoxy's hardened up. Start it over, that's crap. This is the most ghetto setup. Ooh, let's see here, let me move my fancy tripod. Got my extension cord on my shop vac to my surge protector and my table full of all the crap I moved. Cool dude.